This is PowerPoint set number 2 for your ecology unit. This is population ecology, which is moving on from general ecology, which is what you watched last week. So when we look at the Earth and the living and non-living things on the Earth, you can think of it as a funnel, right? We start with like the big picture of the Earth, and then we move towards a very specific view. A population is a group of individuals of the same species living in an area together, so they interact. Depending upon the species, we'll see 3 different types of distribution patterns. Populations disperse in a variety of ways, and there are environmental factors and social factors that influence that. A uniform distribution, like we see in the penguins up top, is the result of intense competition or antagonism, so like aggressive mentalities between individuals. This is kind of a every man for himself type species, and we see this a lot in like penguins and other carnivorous organisms who are competing for food, and they have to like catch their food. Random distribution, we see that in a lot of plants. There's no competition, no like aggressive behavior or tendency to clump together. We see this mostly in plants and organisms that don't compete with each other, but also don't need the group. Clumping is the most common because the environmental conditions are not very uniform, and so groups of organisms will come together where the environment is most beneficial. We also see this in the pack mentality, or herds of organisms, or organisms that are preyed upon need to be in larger groups. We see this in our tropical fish in the image below. There are multiple reasons why organisms would clump together, and that's important to remember. Clumped distribution in a species acts as a mechanism against predation. It means that if I'm in a bigger group, I am more likely to be able to protect myself and my offspring. I won't be cornered by something that is preying upon me if I'm in a large group. The issue is that we see that young, old, and sick organisms are the most likely to be singled out from a herd. So that is one of the reasons why we see like pack animals. We also see that predators work in packs as well. They will kill larger organisms. We see it in like wild cats all the time, preying upon large ungulates, which are like hooved animals. They will prey upon things in groups. So when we talk about population dispersal, or like the spreading out of a certain species, the natural range expansions show the influence of dispersal on distribution. So distribution is the set pattern we see, whereas dispersal is how they move from a central location, right? Once I have been born and I am capable of functioning on my own, I will disperse to a certain location. What we call the natural range is basically where you could find an organism. The example below are cattle egrets in North America. They are these like egrets that basically feed off of like the bugs and stuff that live on cattle, and they started in one place because they were brought over, I believe, from Europe, potentially, I have to look it up, but they were brought over in the late 1800s. They started spreading wherever they could survive, and that was pretty much anywhere cattle were. And as the cattle dispersed and their distribution grew larger, as did the egrets. In rare cases, what we'll see is that dispersal will create a totally new species. Long distance dispersal can lead to adaptive radiation, which is basically organisms adapting so far away from their original species that they become a new species, and we'll talk more about that in our evolution unit. The Hawaiian silver sword, this is a really large plant that we see. They're actually a diverse group of plants descended from North American tarweed. They basically dispersed so far from North America towards Hawaii and other islands, and were eventually selected, right? We talk about natural selection. They were selected towards being very large, big plants that can survive in the Hawaiian environment and are now considered a separate species. This is kind of a good chance to practice your interpretation of graphs. This actually appeared on an AP test a while ago, so I would recommend pausing here and taking a look at what's going on. Some things to ask yourself are in the column. I won't read them because you can read and pause, but think about these things. Can you determine that based on this image? So when we talk about geographic range, sometimes we always kind of gravitate towards organisms that continually spread larger into a larger geographic range, but we don't think much about the small geographic ranges, and these are organisms that favor very, very specific conditions. The blue jay, a North American bird, we look at that as the geographic range increases, there are smaller groupings of these organisms. They prefer to stay within a certain area together. There are also obviously organisms that we see that have a really large geographic range. This is usually more adaptable plants that can live in a very large range. We also see that plants are probably one of the most adaptable organisms. They basically need just a few things to survive, and so we see that these coniferous trees will spread in a very large geographic range. Things that impact that geographic range are going to be interactions, also going to be biotic factors, chemical and physical biotic factors. This is the range of the red kangaroos in Australia. Not only does the human locations dictate where they are present, but we also see that the temperature, the precipitation, the climate all dictate where we see the most kangaroos, and we can see what is probably the most beneficial location for these kangaroos. We are going to be talking about mark and recapture technique in class. We're actually going to be doing a lab looking at it, but essentially the idea of the mark and recapture technique is that when I look at a population, right, a group of species in an area, and I want to know how many exist, our first thought is let's count them all. That is not necessarily a very beneficial way of doing things, especially when your population is really huge. This means that we're going to struggle to estimate the size. And so the best way to do this is using the mark and recapture technique. This is the formula that we use, and I will go over this. Just make sure you write down the actual formula. Basically what happens is I take a sample. So I collect, let's say I'm looking at squirrels. I take 20 squirrels. I catch them in, have-a-heart traps. I tag them and I release them. I know now that there are 20 squirrels in the area that have a tag on them. That's the S. I know that I'm going to take another sample. I'm going to take 20 more of my organisms, and I'm going to mark them, and I'm going to release them. What I want to look for is when I collect that second group of organisms, how many that I've collected have the tag from the first sample. If I have very few, let's say one squirrel has a tag the second time I collect them, I know that there's a lot more squirrels out there, right? Because all of my tagged squirrels are blending into that larger group. Let's say I sample 20 and then I sample 20 again and they all have tags. Predictably, I would think that my population is very small. There's not a lot of other squirrels out there that don't have the tag from the first time I was tagging things. And we'll get into this. Please just make sure that you have the formula as well as what each letter represents. We will go over this. You can pause if you want to do this example, but we are going to do it in class, so it's not necessary. Think about these questions, because marking and recapture is not always the most beneficial way to determine the size. If it's a smaller population, counting them is totally feasible. So take a minute to pause, run through these, make sure you can identify when you would use mark and recapture. When we think about the size of population, we have to think about the fact that A, this fluctuates very often, and B, a lot of factors influence how big or small that population is going to get. The first thing we want to talk about is survivorship curves. So when we look at survivorship curves, there are 3 types. There's going to be type 1. We are considered type 1. Survivorship curves are how someone's life is going to look from start to finish. And I'll kind of clarify on this. Type 1. When we look at this graph, we know that the percent of the maximum lifespan years. So, right, 0 would be when I'm born, 100 would be when I die. So my x-axis is basically just the progression of my life. The y-axis is looking at my survival rate per 1,000. What we see is that at birth, type 1, like humans, have almost 100% chance of surviving. Whereas my death rate, once I get to 100, pretty much everyone is dying off around 100. When we look at my type 2, we see that when I am born, I have almost 100% chance of surviving, but my chance of dying starts to increase as I move through my lifespan. We see that there's a steady rate of decline of the size of population. We see that my oysters are type 3. Very quickly after birth, I may die. And then as I get into my later years, if I get to that point, I'm going to survive for a while. So that's type 1, type 2, and type 3. We need to think about what does that say about the way that we exist as a population. What do we do to our offspring? What do we do to our older members of the population? It says a lot about the organism. When we look at type 1 and type 2, we see that there's a lot of nurturing of the organisms as infants, probably a smaller number of organisms or offspring are produced, right? I can have 1 baby a year, basically. A lot of larger mammals go even longer. So I put all of my nurturing into that one organism, they better survive. By the time that we get to 100, our systems start to fail. People start dying, 80 to 100, if we're just looking at statistics. We see that for organisms like squirrels, for the hydra, for type 2, yes, they invest a lot of time in nurturing their offspring, but there's a lot more risk factors to a smaller mammal. Whereas as a larger mammal, there are not a lot of threats to me. We see that in our type 3 species, there's pretty much no care, and it's because they give birth to a large amount of offspring. Fish, right? I'm laying millions of eggs. Some of them fertilize, some of them don't. Turtles, all of these things. Turtles are a great example, right? I lay hundreds of eggs. Maybe 5 of them make it to the ocean. Maybe 2 of them survive past adolescence. But once they get past that adolescent stage, they're going to survive for a long time. So when we think about how the population deals with its offspring, we then start thinking about the population growth curve, which is over time, how does the population itself get bigger or get smaller? All of those things. You can usually track it by year, and so this would be a yellow perch in Lake Winnipeg. We see that there's some factors influencing it. I'm going to pause it here and switch over to the next video so that I do not get cut off. You will pick this up part 2, Intro to Population Ecology.